Sarah Johnson pulled her white nurse's coat tighter around her shoulders as she walked through the busy halls of Atlanta General Hospital. It was just another Tuesday morning in September, or so she thought. The 28-year-old nurse had no idea that this ordinary day would change her life forever. "Sarah, we have a new patient in room 305, Lisa," a head nurse called out while handing her a thick medical file. "He needs physical therapy support. Car accident victim." Sarah nodded and took the file, reading it as she walked. James Bennett, 32 years old, software engineer, paralyzed from the waist down after a terrible accident 3 months ago. She had seen many similar cases, but something about his photo made her pause. There was a spark in his eyes, even in the hospital ID picture. When she entered room 305, she found James sitting in his wheelchair, looking out the window. The morning sunlight touched his face, highlighting the small scars that were still healing. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and that's when Sarah saw it, the same bright smile from his photo, but even more powerful in person. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett. I'm Sarah Johnson, your physical therapist for the rehabilitation program," she said warmly. "Please call me James," he replied, his voice deep and friendly. "And let me guess, you're here to torture me with exercises?" He winked, and Sarah couldn't help but laugh. Over the next hour, as Sarah helped James with his exercises, she noticed something different about him. Unlike many patients who felt defeated by their condition, James asked questions, made jokes, and showed real interest in understanding each movement she taught him. "You know," he said while doing his arm stretches, "I used to think coding was hard, but this is like trying to debug a program where your whole body is the computer." His laugh was genuine, despite the sweat on his forehead from the effort. During their sessions that week, Sarah learned more about James. He had been driving home late from work when a drunk driver hit his car. But instead of dwelling on the tragedy, he talked about his plans to create software that could help other disabled people. "Life's funny sometimes," he told her during one session. "Before the accident, I was so busy making apps for people to waste time on their phones. Now I finally feel like I can make something that really matters." Sarah found herself looking forward to their sessions. She noticed small things about him, how his eyes crinkled when he smiled, how he never complained even when the exercises were tough, and how he remembered little details about the stories she shared. Other nurses started to notice too. "Girl, that patient in 305 lights up like a Christmas tree when you walk in," her friend Michelle teased her one day at the nurse's station. Sarah brushed off the comments, trying to keep things professional, but she couldn't deny that something was different about James. It wasn't just his positive attitude or his kindness. There was a depth to him that drew her in. One rainy afternoon, as Sarah was helping James practice his wheelchair skills in the hospital garden area, he suddenly stopped. "Sarah," he said seriously, "I know I'm just another patient, and you're just doing your job, but I want you to know that you've made these tough days so much better." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She knew she should keep her professional distance, but standing there in the rain, looking at James's honest face, she realized that something had shifted. This wasn't just another patient-nurse relationship anymore. "You're not just another patient, James," she found herself saying softly. The rain continued to fall gently around them, but neither of them moved to go inside. Sometimes the biggest changes in life come on the most ordinary days, and for Sarah Johnson, this was that day. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a love story that would challenge everything she thought she knew about life, love, and what really matters. Little did they know, their story was about to become much bigger than either of them could imagine, touching hearts and changing lives far beyond the walls of Atlanta General Hospital. 2 months into James's physical therapy, Sarah noticed that her feelings were growing stronger with each passing day. She tried to stay professional, but their sessions had become the highlight of her workdays. Even her coworkers could see the special connection between them. One morning, while helping James with his exercises in the therapy room, Lisa, the head nurse, walked in with some unexpected news. "James, your insurance has approved your discharge next week," Lisa announced, checking her clipboard. "You've made excellent progress." Sarah felt her heart sink. She hadn't thought about what would happen when James no longer needed hospital care. The thought of not seeing him every day made her realize just how much she had come to care for him. Later that afternoon, as Sarah was helping James practice using the parallel bars, he cleared his throat nervously. "Sarah, I know I'm about to be discharged, but I was wondering, would you like to have coffee with me sometime? Outside the hospital, I mean. Sarah froze for a moment. This was against all her professional rules. But looking at James's hopeful face, she knew she couldn't say no. I'd like that, she replied softly. However, when Sarah told her family about James, their reactions weren't what she had hoped for. Her mother, Mrs. Johnson, dropped the spoon she was holding during Sunday dinner. A disabled white man? Her mother exclaimed. Sarah, baby, life is already hard enough for a black woman. Why make things more complicated? Her brother Marcus shook his head. Sis, have you thought this through? Taking care of a disabled person isn't easy. This isn't just about love. Sarah felt tears building in her eyes but held them back. James is more than his disability, she said firmly. He's brilliant, kind, and makes me laugh. Why can't you see that? On James's side, things weren't much easier. His parents, while more accepting of Sarah's race, had their own concerns. His mother worried constantly about their future. James, honey, Mrs. Bennet said during one of her visits, are you sure Sarah isn't just feeling sorry for you? She's your nurse, after all. James wheeled his chair back and forth in frustration. Mom, Sarah sees me for who I am. She doesn't pity me. She challenges me to be better. Despite the opposition, Sarah and James went on their first real date at a small coffee shop near the hospital. James had arrived early, nervously adjusting his shirt and making sure his wheelchair was positioned just right at the table. When Sarah walked in, wearing a yellow sundress instead of her usual nurse's uniform, James's face lit up. They talked for hours, learning about each other outside of the hospital setting. James told her about his dreams of creating adaptive technology for disabled people, while Sarah shared her hopes of opening a community health clinic someday. You know, James said, stirring his second cup of coffee, everyone thinks they're protecting us by pointing out all the problems, but they don't see what we see. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. And what do we see? Possibilities, James replied, squeezing her hand. Where they see barriers, I see challenges to overcome. Where they see complications, I see adventures waiting to happen. Their coffee date turned into dinner dates, movie nights, and weekend outings. They learned to navigate the physical challenges together. Sarah discovered that helping James wasn't a burden. It was just another way of showing love, like how he would help her study for her advanced nursing courses or cook her favorite meals. One evening, while they were watching the sunset from a park bench, with Sarah sitting on the bench and James in his wheelchair beside her, a young boy walked by with his mother. Mommy, why is that lady sitting with a man in a wheelchair? The boy asked loudly. Before the embarrassed mother could respond, Sarah smiled and said, because we're in love, sweetie. Love doesn't care about wheelchairs. James looked at her with tears in his eyes. In that simple moment, they both knew that what they had was worth fighting for, no matter what anyone else thought. As the sun set behind the Atlanta skyline, Sarah and James sat in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined. They had broken through the first set of barriers, but they knew there would be more challenges ahead. Yet somehow, sitting there together, those challenges didn't seem so impossible anymore. 6 months into their relationship, Sarah and James faced new challenges as their love grew stronger. They had learned to ignore the stares they got in public. Some people weren't used to seeing an interracial couple, let alone one where the man was in a wheelchair. But Sarah and James had bigger dreams to focus on. One sunny Saturday morning, Sarah visited James at his apartment. He had been excited to show her something he'd been working on. When she arrived, she found him surrounded by computers and strange-looking devices. Remember how I told you I wanted to help other disabled people? James said, his eyes shining with excitement. Well, I've been developing this software that can control home appliances through voice commands. Watch this. James spoke clearly into a microphone. Lights on. The room's lights turned on instantly. TV on, Channel 5. The television came to life, switching to the news channel. Sarah watched in amazement. James, this is incredible. Did you create all of this? Yes, he nodded proudly. I've been working on it during my free time, but that's not all. He wheeled over to another device. I'm also developing an app that helps wheelchair users find accessible routes in the city. No more surprised by stairs or blocked ramps. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. Instead of letting his disability defeat him, James was using his skills to make life better for others. This was one of the many reasons she had fallen in love with him. Their moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was James's parents, making an unexpected visit. Mrs. Bennet's face fell slightly when she saw Sarah there, but Mr. Bennet smiled warmly. "We brought lunch," Mrs. Bennet said, holding up bags of takeout. "Oh, we didn't know you have company, James." "Sarah isn't company, Mom. She's my girlfriend, and I want her to stay for lunch," James said firmly. During lunch, James showed his parents his inventions. His father, an engineer himself, was impressed. "Son, this could really help people. Have you thought about starting your own company?" "Actually," James looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "Sarah and I have been talking about it. She knows many patients who could benefit from this technology." Mrs. Bennet watched their interaction closely. She noticed how Sarah anticipated James's needs without making it obvious, how they communicated with just a look, and most importantly, how happy her son seemed. After lunch, while Sarah was helping clean up in the kitchen, Mrs. Bennet approached her. "I owe you an apology, Sarah," she said softly. "I was wrong about you. I can see now that you truly love my son for who he is." Sarah wiped her hands on a towel and turned to face Mrs. Bennet. "I do love him. His disability is just a part of who he is, like my skin color is part of who I am, but neither of those things define us." Meanwhile, in the living room, Mr. Bennet was having a similar conversation with James. "You know, son," he said, watching James demonstrate his software, "I haven't seen you this passionate about anything since before the accident. Sarah's been good for you." "She's the best thing that's ever happened to me, Dad," James replied. "She doesn't see limitations. She sees possibilities." Later that evening, after James's parents had left, Sarah and James sat on his balcony, watching the city lights come on. James had been unusually quiet. "What's on your mind?" Sarah asked, running her fingers through his hair. "I was thinking about how everyone focused on what made us different. My disability, our races, everything that should have kept us apart. But look at us now. My parents finally accept us. Your brother actually called me bro yesterday, and we're planning a business together." Sarah leaned down and kissed him softly. "Love conquers prejudice, James. Always has, always will." Just then, James's phone buzzed. It was an email from a major technology company expressing interest in his adaptive technology projects. Sarah watched as James's face lit up while reading the email. "They want to meet with us next week," he exclaimed. "Sarah, this could be our chance to really make a difference." As they celebrated this new opportunity, both Sarah and James knew that they had overcome more than just prejudice. They had proven that love, combined with purpose, could break through any barrier. Their story was becoming more than just a romance. It was becoming an inspiration. 1 year into their relationship, James had a secret he was keeping from Sarah. For the past month, he had been planning something special with the help of their closest friends. Every time Sarah wasn't around, he worked on making this moment perfect. It was a warm Saturday evening when James asked Sarah to meet him at Central Park, the place where they had their first outdoor date. Sarah noticed he seemed nervous on the phone, but didn't think much of it. As Sarah walked through the park entrance at 6 p.m., she gasped. The pathway was lined with twinkling lights, and rose petals were scattered on the ground. Their friend Michael, who worked as a photographer, was hiding behind some trees with his camera. Following the trail of roses, Sarah found James waiting by the fountain. He had dressed up in a navy blue suit, his wheelchair decorated with tiny lights that matched the ones along the path. Around him stood their closest friends and family members, all smiling. "What's all this?" Sarah asked, her heart beating faster. James took her hand and cleared his throat. "Sarah Johnson, when I first met you at the hospital, I was at my lowest point. I thought my life was over because of this wheelchair, but you showed me that my life was just beginning." He pulled out a small remote from his pocket, one of his own inventions, and pressed a button. Soft music began playing from hidden speakers, and more lights came on around the fountain. "You never saw my disability as a barrier," James continued, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "You saw me for who I am. You supported my dreams, pushed me to be better, and loved me without conditions." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she realized what was happening. Mrs. Johnson, who had once opposed their relationship, was now wiping her eyes with a tissue. Even Marcus, Sarah's brother was smiling and recording everything on his phone. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. With hands trembling slightly, he opened it to reveal a beautiful diamond ring. "I may not be able to get down on one knee," James said, looking up at Sarah with eyes full of love, "but I can promise you my whole heart, my complete devotion, and a lifetime of trying to make you as happy as you've made me." Sarah was crying now, but her smile was radiant. "Sarah Johnson, will you marry me?" The park fell silent. Everyone held their breath, waiting for her answer. Through her tears, Sarah nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice full of emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." As James slipped the ring onto her finger, their friends and family burst into applause. Mrs. Bennet hugged Mrs. Johnson, both mothers crying happy tears. Marcus came forward to pat James on the back, officially welcoming him to the family. "I have one more surprise," James said, pressing another button on his remote. A large screen that had been hidden behind some trees lit up, showing a video. It was a compilation of their journey together. Photos from their hospital days, their first date, family gatherings, and precious moments they had shared. The final clip was from James' recent meeting with the technology company. They had not only invested in his adaptive technology projects, but had also offered to help fund a foundation that James and Sarah wanted to start, one that would help disabled individuals access new technology. "Our love story is just beginning," James said, holding Sarah's hand tightly. "And I want to spend the rest of my life writing it with you." Later that night, as they celebrated with their loved ones at a nearby restaurant, Sarah couldn't stop looking at her ring. It sparkled in the light, but what made it truly special was the small inscription inside. "Love sees no barriers." Mrs. Johnson leaned over to whisper in her daughter's ear, "I was wrong before, baby. You two were meant for each other." James watched Sarah from across the table, his heart full of joy. The road ahead might not be easy, but they would face it together. His disability, their racial differences, none of it mattered. They had proven that love could overcome any obstacle. As the evening came to an end, Sarah and James sat together, looking at the stars through the restaurant's window. Tomorrow they would start planning their wedding, but tonight was for celebrating the love that had brought them this far, a love that promised to carry them even further. 3 months after the proposal, Sarah and James found themselves deep in wedding preparations. Their small apartment was covered with bridal magazines, color swatches, and venue photographs. But this wasn't going to be just any wedding. They had special considerations to think about. The venue must be completely wheelchair accessible, Sarah insisted during a meeting with their wedding planner, Monica. Not just the main areas, but everywhere James might need to go. James wheeled himself closer to the table where they were discussing plans. "And I want to do our first dance," he said firmly. Both Sarah and Monica looked at him with surprise. "But honey," Sarah started gently, not wanting to discourage him. "I know what you're thinking," James interrupted, a mysterious smile on his face. "Just trust me. I've been working on something special with Dr. Rodriguez from the Rehabilitation Center." Sarah wanted to ask more questions, but James changed the subject to discussing the wedding cake flavors. She noticed he had been spending a lot of time at the Rehabilitation Center lately, but whenever she asked, he would say it was just regular physical therapy. One afternoon, while visiting wedding venues, they faced an uncomfortable situation. The venue manager, an older woman named Mrs. Peters, kept directing all her questions to Sarah, acting as if James wasn't even there. "And where would you like the groom to be positioned during the ceremony?" Mrs. Peters asked Sarah, completely ignoring James. James cleared his throat. "I can answer that myself," he said firmly but politely. "I'd like to be wherever any other groom would be, waiting for my bride at the altar." Mrs. Peters blushed, embarrassed. Sarah squeezed James's shoulder proudly. They decided not to choose that venue. Instead, they found a beautiful modern event center with wide aisles, smooth floors, and ramps everywhere. The owner, Mr. Thompson, treated James with respect and had experience hosting weddings for people with disabilities. "We can modify anything you need," Mr. Thompson assured them. "Your comfort is our priority." As the wedding day grew closer, Sarah noticed James was becoming more secretive. He was making mysterious phone calls and having private meetings with his doctors. When she walked into his apartment one evening, she found him quickly closing his laptop screen. "James, is everything okay?" she asked, worried. You know you can tell me anything, right? He took her hand and smiled. Everything is perfect, my love. I'm just working on your wedding surprise. You trust me, don't you? Sarah nodded, but she couldn't help feeling nervous. Their wedding was just 2 weeks away. Meanwhile, their families had fully embraced the wedding preparations. Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Bennet were working together on the decorations, their previous prejudices forgotten. Marcus had taken charge of the music playlist, making sure to include songs that meant something special to both Sarah and James. One day, while trying on her wedding dress at the boutique, Sarah overheard her mother talking to Mrs. Bennet. "I've never seen my daughter so happy," Mrs. Johnson said softly. "Your son is a wonderful man." "And your daughter brought my James back to life," Mrs. Bennet replied, wiping away a tear. "They were meant to find each other." Sarah smiled, remembering how different things had been a year ago when their families had opposed their relationship. Now here they were, planning a wedding together. The final week before the wedding was hectic. James seemed to be disappearing for hours at a time, always coming back looking tired but excited. Sarah tried not to worry, focusing instead on the final details. "Just remember," Monica told them during their last planning meeting, "no matter what happens, this day is about your love. Everything else is just details." James reached for Sarah's hand under the table and squeezed it. He had a glimmer in his eyes that Sarah couldn't quite read. Whatever he was planning, she knew it would be special. That night, as Sarah lay in bed looking at their engagement photo, she couldn't help but feel that something big was coming. James had overcome so many obstacles in his life. Maybe he had one more surprise up his sleeve. Little did she know, this surprise would leave everyone at the wedding absolutely speechless. The day before the wedding arrived with a mix of excitement and nerves. The wedding rehearsal was scheduled for 4 p.m. at the event center, and Sarah spent the morning getting her final dress alterations done with her mother and bridesmaids. "Something's going on with James," Sarah confided in her best friend and maid of honor, Michelle, while they were at the bridal salon. "He's been so secretive lately. Yesterday, I called the rehabilitation center to bring him lunch. They said he wasn't there for his regular therapy." Michelle exchanged knowing looks with Mrs. Johnson but quickly said, "I'm sure everything's fine. You know James. He probably has something romantic planned." At the same time, across town, James was in a private room at the rehabilitation center with Dr. Rodriguez and a team of specialists. They were working with some high-tech equipment, and James looked both determined and nervous. "Are you sure this will work tomorrow?" James asked Dr. Rodriguez, sweat beading on his forehead from exertion. "We've been practicing for months, James," the doctor assured him. "Just remember everything we've worked on. And remember, if at any point you feel uncomfortable, we have backup plans." When James finally arrived at the wedding rehearsal, he was 30 minutes late. Sarah noticed he looked tired, and there was a small bandage on his arm that hadn't been there the day before. "Where have you been?" Sarah asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "I've been calling you all morning." "I'm sorry, love," James said, kissing her hand. "Just had some last-minute things to take care of. Everything's fine, I promise." During the rehearsal, Sarah noticed more unusual things. James kept having whispered conversations with his best man, Tom, and there was a group of men measuring and marking spots on the floor near the altar. When she asked about it, the wedding coordinator quickly said they were just checking the carpet. "James," Sarah pulled him aside after the rehearsal, "you would tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you? If you're having second thoughts." James's eyes widened in alarm. "Second thoughts? Sarah, marrying you is the one thing in my life I'm absolutely certain about." He pulled her close and whispered, "I love you more than anything. Just trust me for one more day." The rehearsal dinner that evening was at their favorite restaurant, the same one where they had celebrated their engagement. Both families were there, along with their closest friends. But Sarah couldn't help noticing that James barely touched his food, and he kept checking his phone. During the dinner, Marcus stood up to give a toast. "When Sarah first told me she was dating a white guy in a wheelchair," he began, making everyone laugh, "I thought she was crazy. But James proved me wrong. He showed us all what real love looks like," to Sarah and James. Everyone raised their glasses, but Sarah saw James wincing slightly as he lifted his arm. When she asked if he was okay, he just smiled and said he was just tired from all the excitement. Later that night, As everyone was leaving, Dr. Rodriguez showed up at the restaurant. Sarah saw him and James go to a corner for a serious conversation. She tried to approach them, but Mrs. Bennet intercepted her. "Let them talk, dear," James's mother said, leading Sarah away. Men always have last-minute wedding jitters. But Sarah knew James better than that. This wasn't wedding jitters. This was something else. She watched as Dr. Rodriguez handed James a small medical bag and gave him what looked like instructions. As they said goodbye for the night, their last goodbye before becoming husband and wife, James held Sarah longer than usual. "Tomorrow will be perfect," he whispered in her ear. "I have a surprise that will show you and everyone else just how much you mean to me." Sarah went home that night with butterflies in her stomach. As she laid out her wedding dress and veil, she couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring more than just a wedding ceremony. Whatever James was planning, she hoped it wouldn't put his health at risk. Little did she know, the surprise waiting for her at the altar would leave everyone in tears, but for a reason she never could have imagined. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and beautiful. Sarah spent the early hours getting ready with her bridesmaids in one of the event center's preparation rooms. Her white dress was everything she had dreamed of, elegant, flowing, with delicate lace details that sparkled in the light. "You look like an angel," Mrs. Johnson said, tears in her eyes as she helped adjust Sarah's veil. The mother and daughter shared a tight hug, both remembering how far they had come from the days when Mrs. Johnson had opposed this marriage. Meanwhile, in another room, James was surrounded by his groomsmen, Dr. Rodriguez, and 2 medical assistants. They were working with something that looked like a high-tech device, carefully hidden under James's tuxedo pants. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Tom, his best man, asked one last time. "You know Sarah would marry you anyway." James nodded firmly. "I've been working toward this moment for months. I want to stand with my bride." The wedding guests began filling the ceremony hall. Everything was perfect. White flowers lined the accessible aisle, soft music played, and sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows. But there was something unusual at the altar. A small medical team stood discreetly to the side, and some technical equipment was hidden behind the flower arrangements. Finally, it was time. The wedding march began to play. James sat in his wheelchair at the altar, looking handsome in his black tuxedo, his heart pounding with anticipation. Dr. Rodriguez stood nearby, holding what looked like a remote control. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle first, followed by little flower girls spreading rose petals. Then everyone stood as the doors opened for the bride. Sarah appeared in her stunning white dress, holding her father's arm. She looked radiant, her smile lighting up the entire room. But as she started walking down the aisle, she noticed something happening at the altar. James pressed a button on his wheelchair. Slowly, carefully, with the help of an experimental exoskeleton hidden under his tuxedo, he began to rise. The medical team moved forward slightly, ready to assist if needed. The guests gasped in amazement. Sarah stopped walking, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Tears immediately filled her eyes as she watched her groom, the man she had known only in a wheelchair, slowly stand up. James stood tall, supported by the advanced medical technology he had been secretly working with for months. Dr. Rodriguez and the team stayed close, monitoring everything through tablets, but James was doing it. He was standing. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Her father squeezed her arm gently, encouraging her to keep walking. As Sarah reached the altar, James stood proudly, though she could see the effort it took. He reached out his hand to her, just like he had dreamed of doing. "I wanted to stand beside you as we start our life together," James said softly, his voice shaking with emotion. "You've always seen me as more than my disability. Today, I stand here because of your love and support." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Johnson held each other, crying happy tears. Marcus filmed everything on his phone, his own eyes glistening. The minister began the ceremony, but hardly anyone could focus on the words. They were all watching in awe as James continued to stand, holding Sarah's hands, looking into her eyes as if she were the only person in the world. "I was afraid when you were being so secretive," Sarah whispered during the ring exchange. "I thought something was wrong." James smiled. "Something was very right. I've been training with this experimental exoskeleton for months, wanting to give you this moment." When it was time for their first kiss as husband and wife, James stood strong, pulling Sarah close. The guests erupted in applause and cheers, celebrating not just their love, but the incredible determination that had made this moment possible. As they turned to face their guests as Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, Sarah couldn't stop smiling through her tears. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a moment that proved that love, determination, and modern technology could make miracles happen. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of their incredible journey together. The video of James standing at his wedding went viral within hours. News stations across the country wanted to tell their story, not just about the wedding surprise, but about the love that had conquered so many barriers. 2 weeks after returning from their honeymoon in Hawaii, where James had amazed Sarah by standing with her on the beach at sunset, they found themselves sitting in a major TV studio. The morning show host smiled warmly as she interviewed them. "So, James, tell us about this incredible technology that helped you stand at your wedding," the host asked. James squeezed Sarah's hand before answering. The exoskeleton was developed by a team at Atlanta Medical Center. I have been secretly working with them for months, training my body to use it, but the real story isn't about the technology, it's about love breaking down barriers. Sarah wiped away a tear as she added, "When I first met James as his nurse, people told us we had too many differences, his disability, our different races, everything. But love doesn't see those things." Their story touched millions of hearts. Messages poured in from interracial couples, disabled individuals, and people facing their own challenges. Everyone wanted to know more about the couple who had proved that love could overcome any obstacle. But James and Sarah had bigger plans than just sharing their story. Using the attention their wedding video had received, they launched the Bennett Foundation for Adaptive Technology. The foundation's mission was to help disabled individuals access the latest medical technology, regardless of their ability to pay. Everyone deserves a chance to stand tall. James often said in his speeches at fundraising events, whether that's physically, like I did at my wedding, or metaphorically, by having the tools they need to live their best lives. Sarah continued working as a nurse, but now she also helped run the foundation. Together, they created a program that connected disabled patients with the latest adaptive technologies. Their office walls were covered with photos of people they had helped, people standing, walking, or using devices that gave them more independence. 1 year after their wedding, they received amazing news. The medical team that had developed James's exoskeleton wanted to work with the Bennett Foundation to make the technology more widely available. Major companies offered funding, impressed by James and Sarah's dedication to helping others. Mrs. Johnson, who had once worried about her daughter's choice, became one of their biggest supporters. She volunteered at foundation events, proudly telling everyone how her daughter and son-in-law were changing lives. "I was wrong to doubt their love," she told a group of parents at a foundation meeting. "They showed us all that the heart doesn't recognize barriers." Marcus helped too, using his social media skills to spread awareness about the foundation's work. He created viral campaigns that brought attention to disability rights and the need for accessible technology. On their first wedding anniversary, James surprised Sarah again. Using his improved exoskeleton, he not only stood but took a few steps with her in their backyard garden. Sarah cried happy tears, just like she had at their wedding. "You never stop amazing me," she whispered, holding him close. "And you never stop inspiring me," James replied. "Every person we help through the foundation, every life we change, it's all because you saw past my wheelchair that first day in the hospital." Their love story had become more than just about them. It had turned into a movement, inspiring people to look past differences and see the person within. The media called them the couple who broke all barriers, but to James and Sarah, they were just two people who had followed their hearts. As they sat in their garden that evening, watching the sunset, Sarah rested her head on James's shoulder. "Did you ever imagine our love would help so many people?" she asked. James smiled, running his fingers through her hair. "Love multiplies when you share it," he said. "We're just getting started." And he was right. Their story had opened doors, changed minds, and given hope to countless others. But most importantly, it had proved that true love knows no boundaries, not race, not disability, not anything. It was, and would always be, simply about two hearts finding each other and refusing to let go.